Welcome to Rampaging Rex Productions. Today's video covers a nightmare from which you may never awake. This is the most frightening dark ride that humanity has ever created. Unless you rode Monstars of Rock. So bring back Freestyle Music Park and,
hi there. Enjoy the video. If you visited Kennywood in the last few years, chances are one of the first things you saw after entering the park was this, Garfields Nightmare. The attraction seemed out of place in Kennywood for years, but there was a time when Garfield's presence within the park extended way beyond this old mill. It began back in 2001, when the media and enthusiasts were buzzing about Phantom's Revenge. Perhaps wanting to replicate Cedar Fair's success using Peanuts characters in their parks, or maybe just wanting to incorporate a new licensed property, Kennywood advertisements began popping up with Garfield characters in them. Inside the park, the characters could be seen on the many banners hanging from light poles. This seemed innocent enough, but Kennywood had larger plans. After 2001, the presence of Garfield characters in the park grew steadily. Merchandise appeared in the gift shops adorned with Garfield, Odie, and John, and the park's children's area, Kittyland, essentially became Garfield Land. Now that doesn't mean that any of the existing rides had their names changed, no, but the entire area had a Garfield overlay applied to it. Pounce Bounce, a Zamperla Jumpin' Tower 16, was installed in 2002, made to look like a tower of cheese with a statue of Garfield perched on top. Painted on the tower were several mice looking out from the holes in the cheese. Elsewhere in Kittyland, full-size statues of Garfield and Odie were installed, allowing families to take photos with them, and there were even walk-around mascots of the two characters that would appear anywhere within the park. When exiting Kennywood, a new mural could be seen depicting Garfield flying through the sky with the words, "Time flies when you're having fun, thanks for dropping in." Although guests found the Garfield overlay to be a strange fit for Kennywood, most didn't mind it as it was mostly limited to Kittyland. However, 2004 would be the year Garfield truly took over the park. The changes made to Kennywood remained throughout 2003, but one additional change came to be with the closure of the old mill. This classic boat ride was first constructed in 1901, making it Kennywood's oldest standing attraction. The theme of the attraction has changed several times, but in the 1970s it became Hard-Headed Harold's Horrendously Humorous Haunted Hideaway. This lengthy name would revert back to the old mill in the early 90s, but the show scenes remained unchanged. These scenes included a skeleton shootout, a saloon, and an abandoned hearse carriage with the skeleton of a horse in front of it. Although simple in design, the old mill was a treasured classic and a staple of the park for decades. 2003 would be the old mill's final season as Garfield, to the frustration of many, made his way from Kittyland into the old mill, becoming Garfield's Nightmare in 2004. The Garfield overlay was handled by Blacklight Attractions and Halloween Productions, the same group that would transform Gold Rusher into Ghostwood Estate a few years later. And while Ghostwood Estate is considered to be a solid, well-themed dark ride, Garfield's Nightmare quickly grew a reputation as one of the most hated dark rides ever created. The path the boats followed remained unchanged, but the interior of the attraction became a blacklight fever dream. Glow paint looked as though it had been thrown everywhere in the narrow passages within the old mill, and the show scenes consisted of flat cutouts of the characters, as well as 3D figures with extremely limited movement. Each show scene was prefaced by a Garfield comic strip, continuing the story of the nightmare Garfield was having. During these scenes, Garfield would speak over top of some of the trippiest music and sound effects ever featured on an amusement park ride.
There's something weird about that ice cream.
One notable feature of the previous old mill was that some of the scenes took place outdoors, allowing riders to see other boats passing by. Garfield's Nightmare enclosed these scenes to allow the blacklight effect to be consistent the entire way through. This blacklight also allowed the attraction to be viewed in 3D, as guests were given 3D glasses before riding. If you think the ride looks trippy in this footage, you should have seen it in 3D. After a heaping bowl of cat stew, riders would have their photo taken before the ride came to an end. Although Garfield's Nightmare was mostly enjoyed by young children in its opening year, the attraction's reputation would steadily decline as the years passed. Televisions in the queue playing a pre-show video were removed in 2009, and by 2010, several of the effects were no longer working. It was clear that Garfield was not as popular as the Kennywood management had hoped he would be, and with the purchase of Kennywood by Palace Entertainment in 2007, it was obvious the new owners had no interest in keeping Garfield in the park. The Garfield art in Kittyland was removed, the exit ramp was repainted, the statues were removed and put into permanent storage, and Garfield was even removed from atop the Pounce Bounce Tower. Given that the public's perception of Garfield at Kennywood had soured by this point, these changes all seemed for the better. However, one thing would remain unchanged: Garfield's Nightmare. Despite not being present anywhere else within the park, Garfield's Nightmare would remain unchanged for a total of 16 years, clearly not being maintained as props were only fixed to keep them moving to a certain degree. Some of the colors rubbed off of the comic strips, giving them soulless black eyes, and piles of discarded 3D glasses could be seen in each of the show scenes. Despite calls for years to bring back the previous version of the old mill, the attraction still remained, the Garfield license reportedly being renewed on an annual basis. Finally, in March 2020, Kennywood announced it would be restoring the old mill to its retro western theme, just like before Garfield took it over. The nightmare had finally come to an end. Pounce Bounce was also removed the same year, effectively erasing anything Garfield related from the park. Nowadays, you'd be hard-pressed to find any evidence at Kennywood that Garfield ever had a presence there. The early 2000s stand as one of the strangest eras in the park's history for featuring an IP that really didn't fit in with the rest of the park. In recent years, the park has brought in 2 new licenses with Thomastown and Steelers Country, but these fit in better given the park's location. Garfield just kind of appeared one year and disappeared the other, although his nightmare went on far longer than it should have. But now, we can celebrate the return of the old mill and have a good laugh at one of the most unusual dark rides ever created. Feel free to comment if you remember this era of Kennywood, and I hope you all enjoyed this look back to the early 2000s. See you all next time on Rampaging Rex Productions.
Welcome to Garfield's Nightmare, a nightmare from which you may never awake. This is the most frightening adventure you will ever be on. Unless you have cheese. I like cheese, so give me some cheese and
Hi there. Enjoy your ride.